Hey, what's up guys, TJ here, and today we're going to talk about frame rate, how to use it, what frame rate you should use. This is frame rate explained. So when you're a videographer, frame rate is a really important thing. It's something that you need to know, and something you need to know well. You need to know how to use it, what it does, and all that stuff. We're gonna just explain it a little bit to those who may not want to know everything, but want to know enough so they can use it effectively. So let's start with what frame rate is. Frame rate is basically frames per second. So how many frames are being showed to the viewer per second. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, the camera is showing 24 frames to the viewer per second. 30 frames per second is showing 30, 60, and 120. It's doing the same thing. Now these all have different effects on the viewer. Now what frame rate should you be shooting at? And that's a question that you're gonna have to answer yourself. Depending on your style and what you want to do, you may want to shoot at a different frame rate. So if you want a more cinematic film, you want to shoot at 24 frames per second. If you want to capture quick motion, you may want to shoot at 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. You also want to be using the 180-degree rule and making sure that your shutter speed is twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be at least 50 frames per second. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be 60, and so on and so on. Just make sure you're using that rule whenever you're shooting. You don't want to be any more, you don't want to be any less. Now knowing that, I want to tell you that there's a difference between what you film and what you export in a video project. You may shoot at 60 frames per second, but you may export at 24 frames per second. Now you may have used editing software before, like Final Cut Pro or Premiere Pro, or you can set that to actually use automatic settings. So whatever you import, it will create a project for whatever your frame rate was for that video. But sometimes you may not want to do that. So like say if I shot a 60 frame per second video and I want to slow it down a little bit, I want to put it in a 24 frame per second project, and I want to slow that footage down so that it matches that 24 frames per second. But how slow can you make that footage? And this has been a question that I really didn't know for a long time until I sat down and tried to figure it out. So here I have a camera, and this camera does pretty decent frame rate. One thing you need to know though is that just because it says 30 frames per second, it's not actually 30 frames per second. It's actually like 29.97, something like that. But we're just going to use whole numbers for now. So let's just say we shot a 60 frame per second film and we want to go and edit it in a 24 frame per second project file. Now we want to slow this footage down once we pull it in there, so we have 60 frames per second and a 24 frame per second project file. What we do is we take 24 frames per second and we divide it by 60, and that will give you the number of the amount or percentage that you can slow down that footage. So if you take 24 and you divide it by 60, you get 0.4, which is 40%. So you can slow that footage down to 40% and get some smooth slow motion. Now if you slow it down any more than that, you won't have enough frames to make it a smooth slow motion. Now to recap, when you're shooting video, you want to know your frame rate. You want to know why you're using it. You want to know what it is and the purpose of using it. You also want to know the 180-degree rule. And lastly, we just talked about how to slow down your footage and how to use the proper project files. Now if you guys have any questions about any of these stuff, let me know in the comments below. I have some more tips for you regarding frame rate, and we'll talk about that in a later video. But let me know if you guys have any questions, and let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.